The Last Apprentice, The Revenge of the Witch, Disc 5.
Chapter 13. Hairy Pigs. I ran out of the house and headed north, straight for Hangman's Hill, still in a panic, only slowing down when I'd reached the north pasture. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I was going back to Chippenden. Only the spook could help me now. Once I'd reached the boundary fence, the animals suddenly fell silent, and I turned and looked back toward the farm. Beyond it, I could just see the dirt road winding away in the distance, like a dark stain on the patchwork of grey fields. It was then that I saw a light on the road. There was a cart moving toward the farm. Was it Ma'am? For a few moments, my hopes were high, but as the cart neared the farm gate, I heard a loud hawking cough, the noise of phlegm being gathered in the throat, and then somebody spat. It was just Snout, the pig butcher. He'd 5 of our biggest hairy pigs to deal with. Once dead, each one took a lot of scraping, so he was making an early start. He'd never done me any harm, but I was always glad when he'd finished his business and left. Ma'am had never liked him either. She disliked the way he kept hawking up thick phlegm and spitting it out into the yard. He was a big man, taller even than Jack, with knotted muscles on his forearms. The muscles were necessary for the work he did. Some pigs weighed more than a man, and they fought like mad to avoid the knife. However, there was one part of Snout that had gone to seed. His shirts were always short, with the bottom 2 buttons open, and his fat, white, hairy belly hung down over the brown leather apron he wore to stop his trousers from getting soaked with blood. He couldn't have been much more than 30, but his hair was thin and lank. Disappointed that it wasn't Ma'am, I watched him unhook the lantern from the cart and begin to unload his tools. He set up for business at the front of the barn, right next to the pig pen. I'd wasted enough time. I had started to climb over the fence into the wood when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement on the slope below. A shadow was heading my way, hurrying toward the stile at the far end of the north pasture. It was Alice. I didn't want her following me, but it was better to deal with her now than later, so I sat on the boundary fence and waited for her to reach me. I didn't have to wait long because she ran all the way up the hill. She didn't come that close, but stayed about 9 or 10 paces away, her hands on her hips, trying to catch her breath. I looked her up and down, seeing again the black dress and the pointy shoes. I must have woken her up when I'd run down the stairs. To reach me so soon, she must have gotten dressed quickly and followed me straight away. "I don't want to talk to you," I called across to her, nervousness making my voice wobbly and higher than usual. "Don't waste your time following me either. You've had your chance, so from now on, you'd better keep well away from Chippenden." "You better had talk to me, if you know what's good for you," Alice said. "Soon it'll be too late, so there's something you'd better know. Mother Malkin's already here." "I know that," I said. "I saw her." "Not just in the mirror, though. It ain't just that. She's back there, somewhere inside the house," Alice said, pointing back down the hill. "I told you I know that," I said angrily. "The moonlight showed me the trail she made, and when I came upstairs to tell you that, what did I find? You were already talking to her, and probably not for the first time." I remembered the first night when I went up to Alice's room and gave her the book. As I went inside, the candle had still been smoking in front of the mirror. "You probably brought her here," I accused. "You told her where I was." "Ain't true that," Alice said, an anger in her voice that matched my own. She took about 3 steps closer to me. "Sniffed her out, I did. And I used the mirror to see where she was. Didn't realize she was so close, did I? She was too strong for me, so I couldn't break away. Lucky you came in when you did. Lucky for me, you broke that mirror." I wanted to believe Alice, but how could I trust her? When she moved a couple of paces nearer, I half turned, ready to jump down onto the grass on the other side of the fence. "I'm going back to Chippenden to fetch Mr. Gregory," I told her. "He'll know what to do." "Ain't time for that," said Alice. "When you get back, it'll be too late. There's the baby to think about. Mother Malkin wants to hurt you, but she'll be hungry for human blood. Young blood's what she likes best. That's what makes her strongest." My fear had made me forget about Ellie's baby. Alice was right. The witch wouldn't want to possess it, but she'd certainly want its blood. When I brought the spook back, it would be too late. "But what can I do?" I asked. "What chance have I got against Mother Malkin?" Alice shrugged and turned down the corners of her mouth. "That's your business. Surely old Gregory taught you something that could be useful. If you didn't write it down in that notebook of yours, then maybe it's inside your head. You just have to remember it, that's all. He's not said that much about witches, I said, suddenly feeling annoyed with the spook. Most of my training so far had been about boggarts, with little bits on ghasts and ghosts, while all my problems had been caused by witches. I still didn't trust Alice, but now, after what she'd just said, I couldn't leave for Chippenden. I'd never get the spook back here in time. Her warning about the threat to Ellie's baby seemed well-intentioned, but if Alice were possessed, or on Mother Malkin's side, they were the very words that gave me no choice but to go back down the hill toward the farm. The very words that would keep me from warning the spook, yet keep me where the witch could get her hands on me at a time of her own choosing. On the way down the hill, I kept my distance from Alice, but she was at my side when we walked into the yard and crossed close to the front of the barn. Snout was there, sharpening his knives. He looked up when he saw me and nodded. I nodded back. After he'd nodded at me, he just stared at Alice without speaking, but he looked her up and down twice. Then, just before we reached the kitchen door, he whistled long and loud. Snout's face had more in common with a pig's than with a wolf's, but it was that kind of whistle, heavy with mockery. Alice pretended not to hear him. Before making the breakfast, she had another job to do. She went straight into the kitchen and started preparing the chicken we'd be having for our midday meal. It was hanging from a hook by the door, its neck off and its insides already pulled out the evening before. She set to work cleaning it with water and salt, her eyes concentrating hard on what she was doing so that her busy fingers wouldn't miss the tiniest bit. It was then, as I watched her, that I finally remembered something that might just work against a possessed body. Salt and iron. I couldn't be sure, but it was worth a try. It was what the spook used to bind a boggart into a pit, and it might just work against a witch. If I threw it at someone possessed, it might just drive Mother Malkin out. I didn't trust Alice, and didn't want her to see me helping myself to the salt, so I had to wait until she'd stopped cleaning the chicken and left the kitchen. That done, before going out to start my own chores, I paid a visit to Dad's workshop. It didn't take me long to find what I needed. From among the large collection of files on the shelf above his workbench, I chose the biggest and roughest-toothed of them all. Soon I was filing away at the edge of an old iron bucket, the noise setting my teeth on edge. But it wasn't long before an even louder noise split the air. It was the scream of a dying pig, the first of 5. I knew that Mother Malkin could be anywhere, and if she hadn't already possessed someone, she might choose a victim at any moment. So I had to concentrate and be on my guard at all times. But at least now I had something to defend myself with. Jack wanted me to help Snout, but I was always ready with an excuse, claiming that I was finishing this or just about to do that. If I got stuck working with Snout, I wouldn't be able to keep an eye on everyone else. As I was just his brother visiting for a few days, not the hired help, Jack wasn't able to insist, but he came very close to it. In the end, after lunch, his face as black as thunder, he was forced to help Snout himself, which was exactly what I wanted. If he was working in front of the barn, I could keep an eye on him from a distance. I kept using excuses to check on Alice and Ellie, too. Either one of them could be possessed, but if it were Ellie, there'd not be much chance of saving the baby. Most of the time it was either in her arms or sleeping in its cot close to her side. I had the salt and iron, but I wasn't sure whether it would be enough. The best thing would have been a silver chain. Even a short one would have been better than nothing. When I was little, I'd once overheard Dad and Mam talking about a silver chain that belonged to her. I'd never seen her wearing one, but it might still be in the house somewhere, maybe in the storeroom just below the attic, which Mam always kept locked. But their bedroom wasn't locked. Normally, I'd never have gone into their room without permission, but I was desperate. I searched Mam's jewelry box. There were brooches and rings in the box, but no silver chain. I searched the whole room. I felt really guilty looking through the drawers, but I did it anyway. I thought there might have been a key to the storeroom, but I didn't find it. While I was searching, I heard Jack's big boots coming up the stairs. I kept very still, hardly daring to breathe, but he just came up to his bedroom for a few moments and went straight down again. After that, I completed my search, but found nothing, so I went down to check on everyone once more. That day, the air had been still and calm, but when I walked by the barn, a breeze had sprung up. The sun was beginning to go down, lighting up everything in a warm red glow and promising fine weather for the following day. At the front of the barn, 3 dead pigs were now hanging, head down, from big hooks. They were pink and freshly scraped, the last one still dripping blood into a bucket, and Snout was on his knees wrestling with the fourth, which was giving him a hard time of it. It was difficult to tell which of them was grunting the loudest. Jack, the front of his shirt soaked in blood, glared at me as I passed, but I just smiled and nodded. They were just getting on with the work in hand, and there was still quite a bit to do, so they'd be at it long after the sun had set. But so far, there wasn't the slightest sign of dizziness, not even a hint of possession. Within an hour it was dark. Jack and Snout were still working by the light of the fire that was flickering their shadows across the yard. The horror began as I went to the shed at the back of the barn to fetch a bag of spuds from the storeroom. I heard a scream. It was a scream filled with terror. The scream of a woman facing the very worst thing that could possibly happen to her. I dropped the sack of potatoes and ran around to the front of the barn. There I came to a sudden halt, hardly able to believe what I was seeing. Ellie was standing about 20 paces away, holding out both her arms, screaming and screaming as if she were being tortured. At her feet lay Jack, blood all over his face. I thought Ellie was screaming because of Jack, but no, it was because of Snout. He was facing toward me, as if he were waiting for me to arrive. In his left hand he was holding his favorite sharp knife, the long one he always used to cut a pig's throat. I froze in horror, because I knew what I'd heard in Ellie's scream. With his right arm, he was cradling her baby. There was thick pig blood on Snout's boots, and it was still dripping onto them from his apron. He moved the knife closer to the baby.
"Come here, boy,"
he called in my direction.
"Come to me."
Then he laughed. His mouth had opened and closed as he spoke, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was Mother Malkin's. Neither was it his usual deep belly rumble of laughter. It was the cackle of a witch. I took a slow step toward Snout, then another one. I wanted to get closer to him. I wanted to save Ellie's baby. I tried to go faster, but I couldn't. My feet felt as heavy as lead. It was like desperately trying to run in a nightmare. My legs were moving as if they didn't belong to me. I suddenly realized something that brought me out in a cold sweat. I wasn't just moving toward Snout because I wanted to. It was because Mother Malkin had summoned me. She was drawing me toward him at the pace she wanted, drawing me toward his waiting knife. I wasn't going to the rescue. I was just going to die. I was under some sort of spell, a spell of compulsion. I'd felt something similar down by the river, but just in time my left hand and arm had acted by themselves to knock Mother Malkin into the water. Now my limbs were as powerless as my mind. I was moving closer to Snout, closer and closer to his waiting knife. His eyes were the eyes of Mother Malkin, and his face was bulging horribly. It was as if the witch inside were distorting its shape, swelling the cheeks close to bursting, bulging the eyes close to popping, beetling the brow into craggy, overhanging cliffs. Below them, the bulbous, protruding eyes were centered with fire, casting a red, baleful glow before them. I took another step and felt my heart thud. Another step, and it thudded again. I was much nearer to Snout by now. Thud, thud went my heart, a beat for each step. When I was no more than 5 paces from the waiting knife, I heard Alice running toward us, screaming my name. I saw her out of the corner of my eye, moving out of the darkness into the glow from the fire. She was heading straight toward Snout, her black hair streaming back from her head as if she were running directly into a gale. Without even breaking her stride, she kicked toward Snout with all her might. She aimed just above his leather apron, and I watched the toe of her pointy shoe disappear so deeply into his fat belly that only the heel was visible. Snout gasped, doubled over, and dropped Ellie's baby, but, lithe like a year-old cat, Alice dropped to her knees and caught it just before it hit the ground. Then she spun away, running back toward Ellie. At the very moment that Alice's pointy shoe touched Snout's belly, the spell was broken. I was free again. Free to move my own limbs, free to move, or free to attack. Snout was almost bent in two, but he straightened back up, and although he dropped the baby, he was still holding the knife. I watched as he moved it toward me. He staggered a bit, too, Perhaps he was dizzy, or maybe it was just a reaction to Alice's pointy shoe. Free of the spell, a whole range of feelings surged up inside me. There was sorrow for what had been done to Jack, horror at the danger Ellie's baby had been in, and anger that this could happen to my family. And in that moment, I knew that I was born to be a spook. The very best spook who'd ever lived. I could and would make Mam proud of me. You see, rather than being filled with fear, I was all ice and fire. Deep inside, I was raging, full of hot anger that was threatening to explode, while on the outside, I was as cold as ice, my mind sharp and clear, my breathing slow. I thrust my hands into my breeches pockets, then I brought them out fast, each fist full of what it had found there, and hurled each handful straight at Snout's head. Something white from my right hand and something dark from my left. They came together, a white and a black cloud, just as they struck his face and shoulders. Salt and iron, the same mixture so effective against a boggart. Iron to bleed away its strength, salt to burn it. Iron filings from the edge of the old bucket and salt from Mam's kitchen store. I was just hoping that it would have the same effect on a witch. I suppose having a mixture like that thrown into your face wouldn't do anybody much good. At the very least, it would make you cough and splutter, but the effect on Snout was much worse than that. First, he opened his hand and let the knife fall. Then his eyes rolled up into his head, and he pitched slowly forward down onto his knees. Then he hit his forehead very hard on the ground, and his face twisted to one side. Something thick and slimy began to ooze out of his left nostril. I just stood there, watching, unable to move, as Mother Malkin slowly bubbled and twisted from his nose into the shape that I remembered. It was her, all right, but some of her was the same, while other bits were different. For one thing, she was less than a third of the size she'd been the last time I saw her. Now her shoulders were hardly past my knees, but she was still wearing the long cloak, which was trailing on the ground, and the grey and white hair still fell onto her hunched shoulders like mildewy curtains. It was her skin that was really different. All glistening, strange, and sort of twisted and stretched. However, the red eyes hadn't changed, and they glared at me once before she turned and began to move away toward the corner of the barn. She seemed to be shrinking even more, and I wondered if that was the salt and iron still having an effect. I didn't know what more I could do, so I just stood there watching her go, too exhausted to move. Alice wasn't having that. By now she'd handed the baby to Ellie, and she came running across and made straight for the fire. She picked up a piece of wood that was burning at one end, then ran at Mother Malkin, holding it out in front of her. I knew what she was going to do. One touch and the witch would go up in flames. Something inside me couldn't let that happen because it was too horrible. So I caught Alice by the arm as she ran past and spun her around so that she dropped the burning log. She turned on me, her face full of fury, and I thought I was about to feel a pointy shoe. Instead, she gripped my forearm so tightly that her fingernails actually bit deep into the flesh.
"Get harder or you won't survive,"
she hissed into my face.
"Just doing what old Gregory says won't be enough. You'll die like the others."
She released my arm, and I looked down at it and saw beads of blood where her nails had cut into me.
"You have to burn a witch,"
Alice said, the anger in her voice lessening.
"to make sure they don't come back. Putting them in the ground ain't no good. It just delays things. Old Gregory knows that, but he's too soft to use burning. Now it's too late."
Mother Malkin was disappearing around the side of the barn into the shadows, still shrinking with each step, her black cloak trailing on the ground behind her. It was then that I realized the witch had made a big mistake. She'd taken the wrong route, right across the largest pig pen. By now, she was small enough to fit under the lowest plank of wood. The pigs had had a very bad day. 5 of their number had been slaughtered, and it had been a very noisy, messy business that had probably scared them pretty badly. So they weren't best pleased, to say the least, and it probably wasn't a good time to go into their pen. And big, hairy pigs will eat anything at all. Soon, it was Mother Malkin's turn to scream, and it went on for a long time. "Could be as good as burning, that," said Alice, when the sound finally faded away. I could see the relief in her face. I felt the same. We were both glad it was all over. I was tired, so I just shrugged, not sure what to think. But I was already looking back toward Ellie, and I didn't like what I saw. Ellie was frightened, and she was horrified. She was looking at us as if she couldn't believe what had happened and what we'd done. It was as if she'd seen me properly for the first time, as if she'd suddenly realized what I was. I understood something, too. For the first time, I really felt what it was like to be the spook's apprentice. I'd seen people move to the other side of the road to avoid passing close to us. I'd watched them shiver or cross themselves just because we'd passed through their village, but I hadn't taken it personally. In my mind, it was their reaction to the spook, not me. But I couldn't ignore this, or push it to the side of my mind. It was happening to me directly, and it was happening in my own home. I suddenly felt more alone than I ever had before. Chapter 14. The Spook's Advice. But not everything turned out badly. Jack wasn't dead after all. I didn't like to ask too many questions, because it just got everybody upset, but it seemed that one minute Snout had been about to start scraping the belly of the 5th pig with Jack, and the next he'd suddenly gone berserk and attacked him. It was just pig's blood on Jack's face. He'd been knocked unconscious with a piece of timber. Snout had then gone into the house and snatched the baby. He'd wanted to use it as bait to get me close, so that he could use his knife on me. Of course, the way I'm telling it now isn't quite right. It wasn't really Snout doing these terrible things. He'd been possessed, and Mother Malkin was just using his body. After a couple of hours, Snout recovered and went home puzzled and nursing a very sore belly. He didn't seem to remember anything about what had happened, and none of us wanted to enlighten him. Nobody slept much that night. After building the fire up high, Ellie stayed down in the kitchen all night and wouldn't let the baby out of her sight. Jack went to bed nursing a sore head, but he kept waking up and having to dash outside to be sick in the yard. An hour or so before dawn, Mam came home. She didn't seem very happy either. It was as if something had gone wrong. I lifted her bag to carry it into the house. "Are you all right, Mam?" I asked. "You look tired."
"Never mind me, son. What's happened here? I can tell something's wrong just by looking at your face."
"It's a long story," I said. "We'd better get inside first." When we walked into the kitchen, Ellie was so relieved to see Mam that she started to cry, and that set the baby off crying too. Jack came down then, and everybody tried to tell Mam things at once, but I gave up after a few seconds, because Jack started off on one of his rants. Mam shut him up pretty quickly. "Lower your voice, Jack," she told him. "This is still my house. I can't abide shouting." He wasn't happy at being told off in front of Ellie like that, but he knew better than to argue. She made each one of us tell her exactly what had happened, starting with Jack. I was the last, and when it was my turn, she sent Ellie and Jack up to bed so that we could talk alone. Not that she said much. She just listened quietly, then held my hand. Finally, she went up to Alice's room and spent a long time talking to her alone. The sun had been up less than an hour when the spook arrived. Somehow, I'd been expecting him. He waited at the gate, and I went out and told the tale again while he leaned on his staff. When I'd finished, he shook his head.
"I sensed that something was wrong, lad, but I came too late. Still, you did all right. You used your initiative and managed to remember some of the things I'd taught you. If all else fails, you can always fall back on salt and iron."
"Should I have let Alice burn Mother Malkin?" I asked. He sighed and scratched at his beard.
"As I told you, it's a cruel thing to burn a witch, and I don't hold with it myself."
"I suppose now I'll have to face Mother Malkin again," I said. The spook smiled.
"No, lad. You can rest easy, because she won't be coming back to this world. Not after what happened at the end. Remember what I told you about eating the heart of a witch? Well, those pigs of yours did it for us."
"Not just the heart. They ate up every bit," I told him. "So I'm safe? Really safe? She can't come back?"
"Aye, you're safe from Mother Malkin. There are other threats out there just as bad, but you're safe for now."
I felt a big sense of relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I'd been living in a nightmare, and now, with the threat of Mother Malkin removed, the world seemed a much brighter, happier place. It was over at last, and I could start to look forward to things again. Well, you're safe until you make another silly mistake, the spook added. And don't say you won't. He who never makes a mistake never makes anything. It's part of learning the job. Well, what's to be done now? He asked, squinting into the rising sun. About what? I asked, wondering what he meant. About the girl, lad, he said. It looks like it's the pit for her. I don't see any way around it. But she saved Ellie's baby at the end, I protested. She saved my life as well. She used the mirror, lad. It's a bad sign. Lizzie taught her a lot. Too much. Now she's shown us that she's prepared to use it. What will she do next? But she meant well. She used it to try and find Mother Malkin. Maybe, but she knows too much. And she's clever, too. She's just a girl now. One day she'll be a woman. And some clever women are dangerous. My mam's clever, I told him, annoyed at what he'd said. But she's good, too. Everything she does for the best. She uses her brains to help people. One year when I was really small, the ghasts on Hangman's Hill frightened me so much that I couldn't sleep. Mam went up there after dark, and she shut them up. They were quiet for months and months. I could have added that on our first morning together, the spook had told me that there wasn't much to be done about ghasts, and that Mam had proved him wrong. But I didn't. I'd blurted out too much already, and it didn't need to be said. The spook didn't say anything. He was staring toward the house. Ask my mam what she thinks about Alice, I suggested. She seems to get on well with her. I was going to do that anyway, said the spook. It's about time we had a little talk. You wait here until we're finished. I watched the spook cross the yard. Even before he reached it, the kitchen door opened, and Mam welcomed him over the threshold. Later, it was possible to work out some of the things that they'd said to each other, but they talked together for almost half an hour, and I never did find out whether ghasts came into the conversation. When the spook finally came out into the sunshine, Mam stayed in the doorway. He did something unusual then, something I'd never seen him do before. At first, I thought he'd just nodded at Mam as he said goodbye, but there was a bit more to it than that. There was a movement of his shoulders, too. It was slight, but very definite, so there was no doubt about it. As he took his leave of Mam, the spook gave her a little bow. When he crossed the yard toward me, he seemed to be smiling to himself. I'll be off on my way back to Chippenden now, he said. But I think your mother would like you to stay one more night. Anyway, I'm going to leave it up to you, said the spook. Either bring the girl back and we'll bind her in the pit, or take her to her aunt in Stormen. The choice is yours. Use your instinct for what's right. You'll know what to do. Then he was gone, leaving me with my head whirling. I knew what I wanted to do about Alice, but it had to be the right thing. So I got to eat another of Mam's suppers. Dad was back by then, but although Mam was happy to see him, there was something not quite right, a sort of atmosphere like an invisible cloud hanging over the table. So it wasn't exactly a celebration party, and nobody had much to say. The food was good, though, one of Mam's special hot pots, so I didn't mind the lack of conversation. I was too busy filling my belly and getting second helpings before Jack could scrape the dish clean. Jack had his appetite back, but he was a bit subdued, like everyone else. He'd been through a lot, with a big bump on his forehead to prove it. As for Alice, I hadn't told her what the spook had said, but I felt she knew anyway. She didn't speak once during dinner, but the quietest one of all was Ellie. Despite the joy of having her baby back, what she'd seen had upset her badly, and I could tell it would take some getting over. When the others went up to bed, Mam asked me to stay behind. I sat by the fire in the kitchen, just as I had on the night before I went away to begin my apprenticeship, but something in her face told me this conversation was going to be different. Before, she'd been firm with me but hopeful, confident that things would work out all right. Now she looked sad and uncertain. I've been delivering county babies for nearly 25 years, she said, sitting down in her rocking chair, and I've lost a few. Although it's very sad for the mother and father, it's just something that happens. It happens with farm animals, Tom. You've seen it yourself. I nodded. Every year a few lambs were born dead. It was something you expected. This time, it was worse, Mam said. This time, both the mother and the baby died. Something that's never happened to me before. I know the right herbs and how to blend them. I know how to cope with severe bleeding. I know just what to do. And this mother was young and strong. She shouldn't have died, but I couldn't save her. I did everything I could, but I couldn't save her. It's given me a pain here, a pain in my heart. Ma'am gave a sort of sob and clutched at her chest. For one awful moment I thought she was going to cry, but then she took a deep breath and the strength came back into her face. But sheep die, ma'am, and sometimes cows when giving birth, I told her. A mother was bound to die eventually. It's a miracle that you've gone so long without it happening before. I did my best, but it was hard to console her. Ma'am was taking it very badly. It made her look on the gloomy side of things. It's getting darker, son, she said to me, and it's coming sooner than I expected. I'd hoped you'd be a grown man first, with years of experience under your belt. So you're going to have to listen carefully to everything your master says. Every little thing will count. Going to have to get yourself ready as quickly as you can and work hard at your Latin lessons. She paused then and held out her hand. Let me see the book. When I handed it to her, she flipped through the pages, pausing every so often to read a few lines. Did it help? She asked. Not much, I admitted. Your master wrote this himself. Did he tell you that? I shook my head. Alice said it was written by a priest. Ma'am smiled. Your master was a priest once. That's how he started out. No doubt he'll tell you about it one day. But don't ask. Let him tell you in his own good time. Was that what you and Mr. Gregory talked about? I asked. That and other things, but mainly about Alice. He asked me what I thought should happen to her. I told him he should leave it to you. So have you made up your mind yet? I shrugged. I'm still not sure what to do, but Mr. Gregory said that I should use my instincts. That's good advice, son, Ma'am said. But what do you think, ma'am? I asked. What did you tell Mr. Gregory about Alice? Is Alice a witch? Tell me that at least. No, Ma'am said, slowly weighing her words carefully. She's not a witch, but she will be one day. She was born with the heart of a witch, and she's little choice but to follow that path. Then she should go into the pit at Chippenden, I said sadly, hanging my head. Remember your lessons, Ma'am said sternly. Remember what your master taught you. There's more than one kind of witch. The benign, I said. You mean Alice might turn out to be a good witch who helps others? She might, and she might not. Do you know what I really think? You might not want to hear this. I do, I said. Alice might end up neither good nor bad. She might end up somewhere in between. That would make her very dangerous to know. That girl could be the bane of your life, a blight, a poison on everything you do. Or she might turn out to be the best and strongest friend you'll ever have. Someone who'll make all the difference in the world. I just don't know which way it will go. I can't see it, no matter how hard I try. How could you see it anyway, ma'am? I asked. Mr. Gregory said he doesn't believe in prophecy. He said the future's not fixed. Ma'am put a hand on my shoulder and gave me a little squeeze of reassurance. There's some choice open to us all, she said. But maybe one of the most important decisions you'll ever make will be about Alice. Go to bed now. Get a good night's sleep if you can. Make up your mind tomorrow, when the sun's shining. One thing I didn't ask Ma'am was how she'd managed to silence the ghasts on Hangman's Hill. It was my instincts again. I just knew that it was something she wouldn't want to talk about. In a family, there are some things you don't ask. You know you'll be told when it's the right time. We left soon after dawn, my heart down in my boots. Ellie followed me to the gate. I stopped there, but waved Alice on as she sauntered up the hill, swinging her hips without even once glancing back. I need to say something to you, Tom, Ellie said. It hurts me to do it, but it has to be said. I could tell by her voice that it was going to be bad. I nodded miserably and forced myself to meet her eyes. I was shocked to see that they were streaming with tears. You're still welcome here, Tom, Ellie said, brushing her hair back from her forehead and trying to smile. That's not changed, but we do have to think of our child. So you'll be welcome here, but not after dark. You see, that's what's made Jack so bad-tempered recently. I don't like to tell you just how strongly he feels, but it has to be said now. He doesn't like the job you're doing at all. Not one little bit. It gives him the creeps, and he's scared for the baby. We're frightened, you see. We're frightened that if you're ever here after dark, you might attract something else. You might bring back something bad with you, and we can't risk anything happening to our family. Come and visit us during the day, Tom. Come and see us when the sun's up. And the birds are singing. Ellie hugged me then, and that made it even worse. I knew that something had come between us and that things had changed forever. I felt like crying, but somehow I stopped myself. I don't know how I managed it. There was a big lump in my throat, and I couldn't speak. I watched Ellie walk back to the farmhouse and turned my attention back to the decision I had to make. What should I do about Alice? I'd woken up certain that it was my duty to take her back with me to Chippenden. It seemed the right thing to do, the safe thing to do. It felt like a duty. When I gave Mother Malkin the cakes, I'd let the softness of my heart overrule me, and look where that had gotten me. So it was probably best to deal with Alice now, before it was too late. As the spook said, you had to think of the innocents who might be harmed in the future. On the first day of the journey, we didn't speak to each other much. I just told her we were going back to Chippenden to see the spook. If Alice knew what was going to happen to her, she certainly didn't complain. Then, on the second day, as we got closer to the village and were actually on the lower slopes of the fells, no more than a mile or so from the spook's house, I told Alice what I'd been keeping bottled up inside me, what had been worrying me ever since I'd realized just what the cakes contained. We were sitting on a grassy bank close to the side of the road. The sun had set, and the light was beginning to fail. "Alice, do you ever tell lies?" I asked. "Everybody tells lies sometimes," she replied. "Wouldn't be human if you didn't. But mostly, I tell the truth." "What about that night when I was trapped in the pit? When I asked you about those cakes? You said there hadn't been another child at Lizzie's house. Was that true?" "Didn't see one." "The first one that went missing was no more than a baby. It couldn't have wandered off by itself. Are you sure?" Alice nodded and then bowed her head, staring down at the grass. "I suppose it could have been carried off by wolves," I said. "That's what the village lads thought." "Lizzie said she's seen wolves in these parts. That could be it," Alice agreed. "So what about the cakes, Alice? What was in them?" "Suet and pork bits, mostly. Breadcrumbs, too." "What about the blood, then? Animal blood wouldn't have been good enough for Mother Malkin, not when she needed enough strength to bend the bars over the pit. So where did the blood come from, Alice? The blood that was used in the cakes?" Alice started to cry. I waited patiently for her to finish, then asked the question again. "Well, where did it come from?" "Lizzie said I was still a child," Alice said. "They'd used my blood lots of times, so one more time didn't matter. Don't hurt that much. Not when you get used to it. How could I stop Lizzie anyway?" With that, Alice pushed up her sleeve and showed me her upper arm. There was still enough light to see the scars, and there were a lot of them. Some old, some relatively new. The newest one of all hadn't healed properly yet. It was still weeping. "There's even more than that. Lots more. But I can't show 'em all," Alice said. I didn't know what to say, so I just kept quiet. But I'd already made up my mind, and soon we walked off into the dark, away from Chippenden. I'd decided to take Alice straight to Stawman, where her aunt lived. I couldn't bear the thought of her ending up in a pit in the spook's garden. It was just too terrible. And I remembered another pit. I remembered how Alice had helped me from Tusk's pit just before Bony Lizzie had come to collect my bones. But above all, it was what Alice had just told me that had finally changed my mind. Once, she'd been one of the innocents. Alice had been a victim, too. We climbed Parlick Pike, then moved north onto Blindhurst Fell, always keeping to the high ground. I liked the idea of going to Stawman. It was near the coast, and I'd never seen the sea before, except from the tops of the fells. The route I chose was more than a bit out of the way, but I fancied exploring and liked being up there close to the sun. Anyway, Alice didn't seem to mind at all. It was a good journey, and I enjoyed Alice's company, and for the first time we really started to talk. She taught me a lot, too. She knew the names of more stars than I did, and was really good at catching rabbits. As for plants, Alice was an expert on things that the spook hadn't even mentioned so far, such as deadly nightshade and mandrake. I didn't believe everything she said, but I wrote it down anyway because she'd been taught it by Lizzie, and I thought it was useful to learn what a witch believes. Alice was really good at distinguishing mushrooms from poisonous toadstools, some of which were so dangerous that one bite would stop your heart or drive you insane. I had my notebook with me, and under the heading called Botany, I added 3 more pages of useful information. One night, when we were less than a day's walk from Stallman, we stayed in a forest clearing. We'd just cooked 2 rabbits in the embers of a fire until the meat almost melted in our mouths. After the meal, Alice did something really strange. After turning to face me, she reached across and held my hand. We sat there like that for a long time. She was staring into the embers of the fire, and I was looking up at the stars. I didn't want to break away, but I was all mixed up. My left hand was holding her left hand, and I felt guilty. I felt as if I were holding hands with the dark, and I knew the spook wouldn't like it. There was no way I could get away from the truth. Alice was going to be a witch one day. It was then that I realized Mam was right. It was nothing to do with prophecy. You could see it in Alice's eyes. She'd always be somewhere in between, neither wholly good nor wholly bad. But wasn't that true of all of us? Not one of us was perfect. So I didn't pull my hand away. I just sat there, one part of me enjoying holding her hand, which was sort of comforting after all that had happened, while the other part sweated with guilt. It was Alice who broke away. She took her hand out of mine and then touched my arm where her nails had cut me on the night we destroyed Mother Malkin. You could see the scars clearly in the glow from the embers. "Put my brand on you there," she said with a smile. "That won't ever fade away." I thought it was a strange thing to say, and I wasn't sure what she meant. Back home, we put our brand on cattle. We did it to show that they belonged to us and to stop strays from getting mixed up with animals from neighboring farms. So how could I belong to Alice? The following day, we came down onto a great flat plain. Some of it was mossland, and the worst bits were soggy marsh, but eventually we found our way through to Stallman. I never got to see the aunt, because she wouldn't come out to talk to me. Still, she agreed to take Alice in, so I couldn't complain. There was a big, wide river nearby, and before I left for Chippenden, we walked down its banks as far as the sea. I wasn't really taken with it. It was a grey, windy day, and the water was the same color as the sky, and the waves were big and rough. "You'll be all right here," I said, trying to be cheerful. "It'll be nice when the sun shines." "Just have to make the best of it," Alice said. "Can't be worse than Pendle." I suddenly felt sorry for her again. I felt lonely at times, but at least I had the spook to talk to. Alice didn't even know her aunt properly, and the rough sea made everything seem bleak and cold. "Look, Alice, I don't expect we'll see each other again. But if you ever need help, try to get word to me," I offered. I suppose I said that because Alice was the nearest thing to a friend I had had. And as a promise, it wasn't quite as daft as the first one I'd made her. I didn't commit myself to actually doing anything. Next time she asked for anything, I'd be talking to the spook first. To my surprise, Alice smiled, and she had a strange look in her eyes. It reminded me of what Dad had once said about women sometimes knowing things that men don't. And when you suspect that, you should never ask what they're thinking. "Oh, we'll meet again," Alice said. "Ain't no doubt about that." "I'll have to be off now," I said, turning to leave. "I'll miss you, Tom," Alice said. "Won't be the same without you." "I'll miss you too, Alice," I said, giving her a smile. As the words came out, I thought that I'd said them out of politeness, but I hadn't been on the road more than 10 minutes before I knew I was wrong. I'd meant every word, and I was feeling lonely already. I've written most of this from memory, but some of it from my notebooks and my diary. I'm back at Chippenden now, and the spook is pleased with me. He thinks I'm making really good progress. Boney Lizzie's in the pit where the spook used to keep Mother Malkin. The bars have been straightened out, and she certainly won't be getting any midnight cakes from me. As for Tusk, he's buried in the hole he dug for my grave. Poor Billy Bradley's back in his grave outside the churchyard at Leighton. But at least he's got his thumbs now. None of it's pleasant, but it's something that just goes with the job. You have to like it or lump it, as my dad says. There's something else I should tell you. The spook agrees with what Mam said. He thinks that the winters are getting longer and that the dark is growing in power. He's sure that the job's getting harder and harder. So, keeping that in mind, I'll carry on studying and learning. As my mam once told me, you never know just what you can do until you try. So I'm going to try. I'm going to try just as hard as I possibly can, because I want her to be really proud of me. Now I'm just an apprentice, but one day I'll be the spook. Thomas J. Ward.
The End. You've been listening to The Last Apprentice, The Revenge of the Witch by Joseph Delaney, narrated by Christopher Evan Welch. This book is copyrighted 2005 by Joseph Delaney. If you've enjoyed this book and this performance, Recorded Books recommends Dr. Illuminatus, The Alchemist's Son by Martin Booth, narrated by Stephen Crossley. Real magic is dangerous magic in this modern-day battle against the dark side of ancient alchemy. When siblings Pip and Tim move with their parents to an old English country estate, a mysterious boy named Sebastian, the son of a medieval alchemist, emerges from behind a wall and claims that he's been asleep for nearly 600 years. What's more, Sebastian reveals that they're all in great danger. Enhanced by chants, herbs, and potions drawn from real texts, this is a tale of high action and history, science and magic, certain to cast an irresistible spell. We also recommend A String in the Harp by Nancy Bond, narrated by Barbara Caruso. A year after her mother's sudden death, 15-year-old Jen Morgan's not expecting much from a Christmas holiday in Wales with her family. But then her brother Peter tells her that he's found a strange artifact, a harp key, that shows him pictures from the life of Taliesin, the great bard whose life in 6th century Wales has been immortalized in legend. And of course, Jen doesn't believe him. You'll find a wide selection of titles in the Recorded Books catalog, including bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more. So to order another recorded book, or for a copy of our latest listing, please call the toll-free number found on the back of this book. Don't forget to ask about easy 30-day rentals by mail. On our website, you can browse our catalog, place orders, hear about our latest releases, or tune into narrator profiles and author interviews. So visit us there at www.recordedbooks.com. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.